we shall overcome. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, we are very, very happy to be here to celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm very pleased to have been asked to introduce my husband as your speaker today. So I asked him, what do you want me to talk about? And he said, well, you've done this a few times, so just do it. There's all kinds of stuff I could choose to talk about. So if you've given me the freedom to do that, I'll tell you one thing. So I met Robert in business school. We both went to Duke University for a Fuqua School of Business, and he came in a year after me. So I've been showing him the ropes for a while now. But let me just tell you a little bit about him. He's a quick study. He's a Navy man, served his country, is very passionate about the things that he really believes in. It's people and making sure that we all have the best and opportunities possible. And there's so many other reasons that I love him. But there's one thing that I had to help him get straight. And it was in the morning when sometimes people wake up maybe a little on the wrong side of the bed. And he might say something and doesn't quite, sound right to me. And I would ask him, is that how we're going to start this? And one of the things that he's been able to do, and this is through his whole history, he's been actually in debate. I don't know if you know this about him, but he loves debate. He's excelled in debate throughout high school and college. He kind of would catch on that whenever I said, is this how we're going to start this? Maybe that's not the right way to start this, right? And I think many times, most of us all know that as well. And I think one of the things that he does is has a great way of using his words to move things in the right direction, much like our beloved Dr. King. Finding ways to use your words to move things in the right direction. So while I don't know what he's going to talk about today, just like you, we trust he's going to move this in the right direction. And with that, I'd like to introduce my husband, Robert Kennedy Jr.
Thank you, baby.
Good morning, everyone. So, as Auckland talked about trying to make the record straight, there's one key thing that she left out about our time meeting, and that's how long it actually took us to become a couple. Now, she's going to tell you that it took me 13 years to ask her out. Okay? It didn't take her 13 years, didn't take me 13 years to ask her out. It took her 13 years to figure out I was trying to holler. Now, I usually do my keynote speeches on computer, but my computer has died suddenly. But since I plan for contingencies, I brought the paper copy with me as well. And so we'll just shift gears and keep it moving. So first, giving reverence to God, who's the head of my life, ministers of the gospel who are present, to Madam Mayor, elected officials, Mr. Willie Williams, to all of my brothers and sisters who are still in the struggle for justice. It is so incredibly good to be here with you today. So this whole process started, it was sometime over the holidays. Mr. Willie Williams slid into my DM on Facebook and said that he was interested in me coming to share a few thoughts with you today. And as I kind of sat back and reflected on what it was that I wanted to say, I found myself struggling a little bit. You know, when we think about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's a legacy that's positive. But when we think of some of the things that are happening in the world today, some of those things are negative. Particularly when we start talking about some of the things that are happening in the youth development movement and the number of our youth who are actually engaged in violence. And I often find myself reflecting and thinking about how is it that we can create a world that's better for our young people. Now, as it was mentioned in my biography, I currently have the honor of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the Boys and Girls Clubs of South Alabama. And we are located both in Mobile County and Baldwin County. I want to do one acknowledgement to Mr. Maurice Horsey and his wife Judy, right there. So Maurice is the club director for our club in Foley. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on, but I at least wanted you to know who he was and the fact he is here today. So if it's okay, I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking to you about the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., what he did, what we learned, and how we can apply those lessons today. In the first part of today's presentation, I'll share with you a summary of Dr. King's biography and a few events that shaped the civil rights movement. In the second part of the presentation, I'll extract the lessons learned by focusing on the skills required to lead a movement in the future. With that in mind, we'll go to part one. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in 1929. He was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, educated at Morehouse College, Croswell Theological Seminary, and Boston University. He was married to Coretta Scott and was the father of 4 children. Dr. King served as the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Dr. King served as the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he was well known within religious circles as a leader who advanced civil rights under the umbrella of the nonviolent philosophy that was espoused by Mahatma Gandhi. Without a doubt, Dr. King was one of the most visible leaders of the civil rights movement from 1955 until his death in 1968. Key events. There were 4. The Montgomery bus boycott. The modern civil rights movement started in the mid-1950s. The seeds of discontent were originally planted when Claudette Colvin, a teenager at Booker T. Washington High School in Montgomery, was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white woman on a segregated bus. The Montgomery bus boycott began formally when Rosa Parks, who was the secretary of a NAACP chapter, was arrested for a similar violation a few months later. Upon hearing about this, a group of leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association and elected Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to become its leader. Although he was only 26 years old at the time, he was an effective leader who was able to get over 40,000 people to boycott the transit system. The Birmingham Campaign. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference went to Birmingham to help local leaders plan and extract a nonviolent campaign to end segregation in public places. The campaign commenced with peaceful protest at segregated lunch counters and a peaceful march on City Hall. The peaceful events turned violent when Eugene Bull Connor, who was the municipal director of the police and fire department, ordered his subordinates to attack the protesters with clubs, dogs, and fire hoses. The March on Washington. In 1963, the civil rights community coordinated efforts and organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. There were 6 Cree groups who worked in collaboration. Collaboration, working together, a central underlying theme to the success of any movement. These organizations were the Council for United Civil Rights Leadership, the Congress for Racial Equality, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the NAACP, and the National Urban League. The march was attended by over 250,000 participants and 3,000 print and broadcast journalists. The formal program, conducted on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, had multiple speakers, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The march from Selma to Montgomery. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a significant leadership accomplishment. However, Dr. King and other leaders were not satisfied. After careful reflection, they decided to expand their focus on civil rights to include voting rights as well. In collaboration with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. decided to register voters in Dallas County. When the students commenced the registration, they were arrested by local authorities. When the group attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery to protest the arrest, They were beaten at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in what has been known as Bloody Sunday. Ultimately, they received additional support from President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, and they were able to overcome the opposition that existed here in our region of the country, and Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, talk about a record of accomplishment. The Montgomery bus boycott was successful. The Birmingham campaign was successful. True, protesters were beaten during that campaign. However, President John F. Kennedy intervened and negotiated on behalf of the protesters. The March on Washington was successful. It led directly to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The March from Selma to Montgomery was successful. There was violence at the beginning of this event as well, but President Lyndon B. Johnson intervened, protected the protesters during the march, and ultimately signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. So those were the events that happened under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, let's talk about what we learned from reviewing those events. Part 2, lessons learned from the Civil Rights Movement. Lesson number 1, if you want to lead a movement, anchor the movement in concepts that are simple and easy to understand. The two concepts that served as anchors for the Civil Rights Movement were the economic boycott and the nonviolent protest. The economic boycott was introduced as a concept of operations in the city of Montgomery. The idea was simple: stop providing oppressors with the financial resources to bankroll oppression. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and leaders of the Civil Rights Movement engaged the community, explained the plan, and initiated the boycott. The members of the community understood the concept, aligned with the plan, and quit riding the buses until the policies changed. Ultimately, the segregation policies were abolished because the bus services could not maintain their financial health without the African American customer segment that was helping to provide them with their financial resources. Hashtag, the money always wins. Nonviolent protest was introduced as a concept of operations in the city of Birmingham. The idea was also simple and easy to understand. Stop providing oppressors with the authority to maintain oppression by refusing to obey unjust laws. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and leaders of the movement persuaded members of the community to challenge the immoral laws directly, accept the legal consequences associated with those challenges, and avoid responding to violence with violence. Now, those of us who have grown up in the church tradition are familiar with a phrase in the Bible that is turn the other cheek. So every time that I go to this particular passage, I often think that would have been a challenge for me. There was actually a song out here a couple of years ago. I don't remember what the singer's name was, but it went, "Try Jesus, don't try me." Because I throw hands. Yeah. So the fact that they were able to engage in civil disobedience and do this under the umbrella of nonviolence was truly something that was extraordinary. That takes us to lesson 2. If you want to lead a movement, plot a course, move forward, and continue navigating with a clear set of guiding principles. 3 guiding principles that were used to serve as navigation points for the Civil Rights Movement were moving forward, working together, and building bridges. Now, conventional wisdom says that whenever it is that you're trying to do something, that you really need to have a detailed plan. You have to understand where you are today, where you want to go tomorrow, and how you're going to get from point A to point B. But sometimes, you just need to start moving. So, if we think back in history, we go all the way back to the Civil War. The Civil War lasted 4 years, 1861 to 1865. Reconstruction, which was the point at which everything was supposed to be corrected, lasted for about 12 years, from 1865 to 1867. The seeds of the original Civil Rights Movement weren't actually planted until 1948. That's 77, 78 years of oppression. And once those seeds were set and the folks who were in the movement saw it, they didn't know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, but he actually started, and he started moving forward. And it was through that motion that they were able to develop the plan that was ultimately successful. The second concept was working together. It was successfully deployed during the Montgomery bus boycott. During this challenging time, the leaders of the economic boycott and members of the community were acutely aware that in order to achieve success, they had to work together. To this end, various stakeholder groups coordinated activities to ensure that people who had traditionally relied on public transportation had an affordable alternative at their disposal. So these people basically fit into three buckets. Some of them were able to take taxis, and the taxi cab drivers were charging rates that were comparable to the bus rates at the time. When that became problematic, people started their 1950s, 1960s version of Uber and started using their cars to transport people who were in their social circles. And then, as you know from looking at several of the pictures from the historical perspective, a lot of people just walked. But the point is, they were all working together, and it was them being able to work together at scale which allowed them to deny those financial resources to the people who were oppressing them. The third guiding principle is building bridges. It was successfully deployed during the Birmingham campaign and continued throughout the life of the civil rights movement. Now here, some people thought that in order to be successful with the movement, you had to operate within the confines of your geographical area. Well, we know today that's not actually the case. So while you had Reverend Fred Shuttleworth in Birmingham doing his thing, he's coordinating with Dr. Martin Luther King, who's in Atlanta, doing his thing. Dr. Martin Luther King and that group is also coordinating with the President Kennedy administration in Washington, D.C., and leveraging them to influence what was happening in Birmingham. We can't necessarily create our own boundaries that prevent us from working together, because geography is just a line on a map. As long as we're focused on the same things, we can work together to make sure those things are accomplished. And lesson number 3, if you want to lead a movement, communicate with multiple audiences using a variety of techniques and mediums. The two techniques used to communicate with multiple audiences during the civil rights movement were the written word and the spoken word. The three mediums that were used to communicate with audience at scale were television, radio, and print. I'm only going to focus on the first communication technique because I think it is particularly salient when we talk about transferring the lessons that we learned in the past to the present day, and that is the written word. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. demonstrated enormous proficiency with the written word when he penned the letter from a Birmingham jail. He was inspired to write the letter after reading an article in Birmingham newspaper where members of the clergy attempted to discredit him with innuendo. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used the power of the pen to respond to each and every one of the claims in a manner that was highly poignant. A specific example of this is presented in a quote from the letter. And I quote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the views of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. This wait almost always meant never. We must come to see, as one of our distinguished jurists mentioned, that justice delayed is justice denied." So when you think about what he was able to do by putting his thoughts on paper, he was able to communicate at scale in a way and with people who were going to be outside of the boundaries of his voice. That's the reason why that is so significant. And by anchoring to the concept of nonviolence, just imagine what the national press is thinking, and at the point that he won the Nobel Peace Prize, what the international audience is thinking when they're seeing clergy, folks just trying to get freedom, not responding to the abuse that's coming their way. He was able to leverage the power of the image to help accomplish the goals that we wanted to accomplish. Now, how do we take these lessons and apply them today? As I mentioned at the beginning, I have the honor of serving as the Chief Executive Officer for the Boys and Girls Clubs of South Alabama. So the first lesson that we learned is that if we want to lead a movement, we have to anchor it in a concept that's simple and easy to understand. So here's the reason why the Boys and Girls Club works. 3 things. It's a physical location, it's a program that is engaging, and it is a relationship that is built with a trusted adult. So when I reference Maurice Horsey as the club director in Foley, he has a staff of professionals that work with him there. We have certified therapists teaching art. We have professionals that are teaching music. We have a retired school teacher that's there. And we also have folks with prior military experience that are all working there to create a safe and engaging environment for children. And what we know is that when we create that, we set the stage to be able to build a great future for that child. So with that in mind, I have an ask. I'm not going to pass around the offering plate today, right? But when folks often ask what they can do to help us in the Boys and Girls Club movement, I tell them it's 3 things: time, talent, and treasure. From a time perspective, I'm usually talking about interacting with the children. So if you have volunteer time and you can come and help Maurice and his staff interact with the children, that's $1 that I don't have to spend to hire another staff member, because all of you are doing it with your volunteer hours. Does that make sense to everybody? The second thing is talent. When I talk about talent, I'm not necessarily talking about the children. I'm now talking about the staff and the board. Because if someone, for example, is an expert in transportation management and can come help us understand how we can take our second largest expense item and decrease expenses there, that actually helps us out. If someone happens to be an expert in Excel and can help put together spreadsheets, then we don't have to go hire a consultant at $200 an hour to help us do that sort of thing. So time for the children, talent to support the staff and the board as well. And the last part is treasure. We are very fortunate here in South Alabama when we compare the relationship that we have with all of our public officials to the relationships that some of our peers have throughout the country, because our public officials are very generous and we have a very good public-private partnership when it comes to dollars. So when I'm asking the audience about treasure, it's not necessarily the $1 that you're pulling out of your pocket, although we'll take that as well, but really it's about understanding where those resources exist and making sure that we have the knowledge of the resource, and then we can leverage our internal team to reach out formally to collect that resource. Does that make sense to everybody? Time, talent, and treasure. All right. So, with that, during the course of the presentation today, I've discussed the importance of re-educating ourselves from time to time. We have to remind ourselves of the good, the bad, and the historically ugly in the past in order to properly acknowledge all the progress that has been made to get us to the present. To this end, I shared with you a summary of Dr. King's biography and a few key events that shaped the civil rights movement in the 1950s and the 1960s. I also presented the lessons learned from those key events and the skills that can be applied by those who lead movements in the future. And finally, I talked about how it was we were taking those lessons that we learned from watching Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement and how we're applying those in the youth development movement with the Boys and Girls Club today. So with that, I want to thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts with you today, and I will look forward to continuing to work with you in the future. Thank you.